The final part of Unit 3 covers the Progressive Era from 1900 to 1920. Growth defined the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was an era of bigness, population growth, territorial growth, big cities, big business, big labor, big farms, big mines, etc. All of those created many social, economic, and political problems. The 1890s was a period when dramatic growth of the Gilded Age collapsed into a severe depression in 1893 and exposed many inequities and injustices as Americans began to organize for change. Progressive thinkers adopted the new philosophy of pragmatism because it enabled them to challenge fixed notions that stood in the way of reform. Pragmatism was a new way to address the growing inequities and injustices that were outcomes of the Gilded Age, that were galvanizing public support for change in the 1890s. The question was, what kind of change should we have? Radical, like anarchy or socialism, or moderate change, which would maintain the status quo? Progressivism brought about the changes in philosophies, targeted specific problems caused by the Gilded Age, and had clear-cut goals and motives to ensure its success. The philosophy. It rejected laissez-faire and social Darwinism. It embraced pragmatism. Social problems can be addressed by the government. Public funds should be used to address social problems. Charles Darwin's book Origin of the Species and Karl Marx's Das Kapital had a profound impact on thought about social problems and were the topic of discussion among academics, politicians, leaders, lawyers, teachers. The question they had to answer, were social problems fixed or changeable? The answer came by studying actual human behavior and environment. It was necessary to examine poverty, neglect, abuse, and opportunity. University think tanks did the research. Socialism provided a radical change from laissez-faire policies, with the government taking over key industries from big business. What caused progressivism? Let's start first with the growth of industry or industrialization. Industrialization led to the growth of monopolies, banks, trusts, and railroads, all trying to eliminate competition. It also led to bad working conditions for workers. Finally, it led to a concentration of wealth, which is contributed to by the high protective tariff. Second, you have the growth of cities or urbanization. This was caused largely by the rise of immigration, but led to child labor and poor morals in urban areas. It also led to poor living conditions, especially in tenements and urban ghettos. And finally, political corruption by political machines and city governments. Another cause of progressivism was a need for consumer protection, protecting our food. We also had a need for environmental protection as factories were destroying the environment. And then finally, the threats of socialism and anarchy as the poor people threatened to overthrow the system. The main goals of progressive reform. Most progressives saw dangers in the rising power of big business, violence with labor, concentration of wealth, political machines, unrest of the poor, moral decay, racism, and discrimination. Progressives wanted to build on the existing society and improve the quality of life. They wanted to take the government away from special interest groups, known as lobbyists, and put it back in the hands of people. They wanted to end the abuse of power and social injustice, and they wanted to regulate business and expand democracy. What were their motives? They wanted moderate reform to check the growth of radicalism, like socialism and anarchists. Change slowly, not quickly. The architects of this change were known as muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists who exposed the evils, inequities, and injustices in government, business, and society. The magazine credited with inaugurating the muckraking era in 1902 was McClure's, published since 1893 by Samuel McClure as a stylish, general interest magazine. The groundwork for investigative writing was laid when McClure hired Ida Tarbell and Ray Stannard Baker in 1899, followed by Lincoln Steffens in 1902. Fired by the publisher's enthusiasm to expose corporate trusts, Ida Tarbell began a lengthy inquiry into the history and breadth of John D. Rockefeller's oil interests that resulted in a strong condemnation of the business. Her work eventually was titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. When they appeared in 1901, the articles had an immediate negative effect on the public's opinion of big business as a whole. and helped pave the way for the antitrust prosecution of the Standard Oil Company and its subsequent breakup in 1911. Lincoln Steffens published an article. Two of the most important muckrakers you need to know are Upton Sinclair and Ida B. Wells. Upton Sinclair's graphic account of filthy handling, spoiled meat, and generally unsanitary conditions in the jungle inspired a public outcry and government reform of food inspection laws. Ida B. Wells fought against the horrors of lynching in her book, Southern Horrors and the Red Record. If you remember from Reconstruction, lynching was a common practice in the South after the Civil War. Black people were often hung because they were accused of murder or attempted murder, rape, or violating Jim Crow laws. She was also a founding member of the civil rights organization known as the NAACP. The Progressive Era failed to correct the ills of segregation and discrimination against Black people. Progressives did nothing about those problems because they shared in the prejudice of their times and wanted to push for reforms that affected all of American society and not just one subgroup. Two African Americans emerged to lead the fight for civil rights and how to achieve social equality: Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington was the head of the Tuskegee Institute and gave his Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895, where he argued that blacks' needs for education and economic progress were most important, and they should concentrate on learning industrial skills for better wages. Only after proving their economic worth to society could they hope to achieve political and social equality, so he argued for a gradual end to segregation. W.E.B. Du Bois was the head of the Niagara Movement, a group of black intellectuals. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois argued for the exact opposite. He criticized Washington's approach and demanded equal rights for African Americans immediately. He argued that political and social equality were a prerequisite for economic independence. Many civil rights organizations were founded during the Progressive Era because of increased discrimination. I mentioned the Niagara Movement, the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the National Urban League were all established. Besides muckrakers, photographers were influential in exposing the problems of the era. Lewis Hine was an American sociologist and photographer. Hine used his camera as a tool for social reform. His photographs were instrumental in changing the child labor laws in the United States. Jacob Riis. His startling print and photographic exposés of conditions in New York City's slums influenced a generation of investigative reporters. In 1890, Riis wrote How the Other Half Lives. In it, he drew on his experiences as a police reporter to tell what the tenements are and how they grew to be what they are. Packed with harrowing details and illustrated with drawings based on Riis's photographs, How the Other Half Lives was a powerful indictment of slum conditions. The Wisconsin idea was a Progressive Era policy to apply the expertise of the state's university to social legislation that benefited all the state's citizens. It led to classic programs such as the regulation of utilities, workers' compensation, tax reform, and university extension services, sometimes expressed in the maxim that the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. Robert La Follette, first as governor and then as a senator, employed the Wisconsin idea and became a leader in the progressive movement. He believed that the government required control of institutions by the voters rather than special interests, and that the involvement of specialists in law, economics, and social and natural sciences would produce the most effective government. Now let's talk about the Progressive Era reforms themselves. We'll start at the local and state level. The Australian ballot, or secret ballot, is a system of voting in which voters mark their choices in privacy on uniform ballots printed and distributed by the government. Voting by Australian ballot usually takes place in a prescribed manner. The voting boxes are required to be of certain dimensions and closed, the only opening being a small slit at the top. These containers are examined before the poll begins and cannot be opened until the count begins. The voter marks the ballot, often while standing in a special booth, and after the voter's right to vote has been verified, the vote is placed inside the container. Direct primaries function as a preliminary election whereby voters decide their party's candidates. The initiative is a process that enables citizens to bypass their state legislature by placing proposed laws and, in some states, constitutional amendments on the ballot. A referendum is a method that allows citizens to vote on proposed laws written by the people or in some cases the state legislatures. Finally, the recall enables voters to remove a corrupt or unsatisfactory politician from office by majority vote before that official's term has expired. The impact of these three reforms is that it gives more power in the hands of the people.